Watford Station is a pleasant-looking station at the end of the Metropolitan line, way out in Zone 7. It's fairly quiet. It looks a little bit old-fashioned. One thing you can't say about it, though, is that it's a great way to get to Watford. It's about a mile from the centre of town, and there's a story there. The line here was opened in 1925, having been planned since before the First World War. It was a joint venture between the Metropolitan Railway and the London and North Eastern Railway, and consisted of two stations, Croxley and our friend Watford. The line was electrified from the start, which was a pretty major sign of confidence back in 1925. The line even had trains especially built for it that would come to be known as the T-stock. And to be fair to all concerned, it wasn't unreasonable to be confident in the line. Watford was a major market town. It was reasonable to expect a decent amount of commuter traffic. In fact, the Metropolitan were so confident in their new line that they planned a third station right in the middle of town. The station we call Watford was never intended to be the Watford station. In fact, the Watford station we got was primarily intended as a goods station. The Watford station was to be here, what's now the Moon Underwater pub. Once you know that Watford, the station we know, wasn't intended to be the end of the line, its architecture and situation makes quite a lot of sense. Watford is a smaller station than Croxley, and it's on a relatively quiet residential street, hardly befitting the terminus of a company with grand aspirations like the Metropolitan. The station was designed by C.W. Clarke, and I always think he's the great forgotten architect of the London Underground. Leslie Green and Charles Holden get a lot of recognition, but not poor old Charles Walter Clarke. I don't want to get too sidetracked, ha ha ha. But his stations mostly come in two flavours. There are the neoclassical ones like Paddington and Farringdon, and then there's what are known as the domestic style, like Watford. These stations were intended to look like country houses. This was a central part of the Metroland brand. Metroland was a big money spinner for the Metropolitan Railway. The Metropolitan Railway, uniquely among railways, was able to use its surplus land acquired during construction for property development. Normally, railways would have to dispose of any surplus land they had left over at the end of construction. The Metropolitan took advantage of this and created the marketing device of Metroland to sell their houses. The idealistic vision of a house in the countryside within easy reach of London by train. The houses on this street, which is actually called Metropolitan Station Approach, are absolutely peak Metroland. You can see how Watford Station was designed to blend in with all this. It's quite arts and crafts, with a number of features that we would now call retro, as in they were old-fashioned even for the time the station was built. Like the heavy canopy out in front. These chimneys reflect the fact that these stations had no central heating, but instead coal fires, which feels like something of an ironic contrast to the up-to-date electric trains down below. I can't imagine that the staff working here in the depths of winter would have appreciated the Metropolitan Railway's commitment to its brand. So what about that other station? Well, the history is kind of complicated. So in 1911, the local council essentially invited the Metropolitan to build a line here. So far, so good. The Metropolitan were well up for that and started acquiring land. They acquired this building, along with a strip of land behind it and several parcels of land along the route. C.W. Clarke came up with a design involving fronting the lower half of this building in stone and the upper half in brick, kind of a combination of his urban and country styles. Now here I must confess that I've come across about 4 different versions of events as to how things went, so this is just the version of events that I've been able to piece together that isn't contradicted by contemporary sources. For instance, I have one book that states that Clarke actually did rebuild the facade, but if he did, it's not in any photos from the era. But, long story short, the Met did buy the building, they did acquire land, they didn't do much else, as far as I can tell, but everyone was very excited. But then the council started getting funny about the line they had requested. They objected to a line running through Cassiodbury Park, which hadn't existed when the line was first planned. The Metropolitan proposed alternative routes, none of which were entirely satisfactory. To avoid upsetting anyone, the new routes had to be built in tunnels, which was an expensive investment. In the end, none of it went ahead. The Met reluctantly settled on their out-of-town terminus. The planned station in the centre of Watford was rented out to various businesses. At present, it's a Wetherspoons pub called the Moon Underwater. This pub features a portrait of George Orwell on the sign outside, because Orwell wrote an essay called The Moon Underwater describing his ideal pub. Wetherspoons, in theory at least, attempts to replicate that ambience in its venues. Thus, drinking in a Wetherspoons can truly be called an Orwellian experience. I do wonder, if the Metropolitan had got what it wanted, would Watford Station still be called Watford Station? Would they even have built a station here? As things stand, it is rather misleading. The station you need for the centre of town is Watford High Street on the Overground. In fact, the Metropolitan was deliberately misleading in its marketing. Posters depicted the area around Watford Market with the clear implication, if not the outright statement, that the Metropolitan did serve the centre of town. These days, the Metropolitan, as part of the Underground and the London and North Eastern Railway, no longer exists. The current train company is nothing to do with the old railway. Yet the dream of running underground trains to the actual centre of town never quite died. And in 2011, or 2011, whichever you prefer, I know from my comment section that some people get quite worked up about these things, a new proposal was put forward. This was known as the Croxley Rail Link. This really merits a video in its own right, but long story short, this would have involved taking over an abandoned line from Croxley to Watford High Street, and from there running trains onward to Watford Junction, over the Watford DC line, as what is now the Overground. Sadly, for old Watford, this would have entailed abandoning the current station. But it didn't happen, and it's not likely to happen. Funding is, we are told, not available. So, good news for Watford Station, bad news for the credibility of the Metropolitan Railway's publicity department. Hello all, I do hope you enjoyed this out-of-centre tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like, and if the mood takes you, subscribe for more. Maybe even hit the bell icon to be kept notified of my future videos. I'd like, as always, to thank my generous donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the rail link to my Croxley. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.